welcome back to The Other 51, the podcast where we get your favorite writers to spill all of their secrets. My name's Brian Moritz. Thanks for being here. Thanks for following us wherever you do. And this week, very excited to have one of my favorite writers, a guy whose writing I've been admiring and reading for a long time now, and very grateful to have him here. He has written for Grantland. He is an author, a journalist, a screenwriter, and the writer of the Throwbacks Substack, which we're going to be talking about today. Michael Weinreb, welcome to The Other 51.
Thank you, Brian. Appreciate it.
Appreciate you being here. And like I said, I've been an admirer of your writing for a long time. Going back really to the Grantland days is where I think I first kind of discovered your writing, and wanted to ask you about that because it feels like Grantland's one of those sites that starting to get nostalgic for these days, right? It kind of feels like, I was thinking about it the other day. In a way, this might sound weird. It kind of feels like our generation's version of the National Sports Daily, in that it's like the last bastion of like the writer-centric platform. I don't know. Am I off base on that? Do you kind of get that sense too?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I think that's what the goal of it was. Like literally, if I remember, one of the first pieces that they ran was like an oral history of the National, in part because a lot of what Bill Simmons was trying to do was emulate that, and bring that voice. And yeah, it's weird to think how long ago that was now, I mean, it was only what, 12, 13 years ago, but like that's an eternity in internet time. And I think it just sort of fit into that moment where social media hadn't fully caught on yet and people wanted something more substantial to read on the internet. And it was able to, survive for a few years doing that until, everything fell apart.
Right. And so what was it like writing for Grantland back in the day? I mean, kind of what was, the stuff you were writing about? I know you wrote a lot about college football as one of your specialties, but what was it like being a part of that site that is kind of so brief, but really kind of influential, I think, for a lot of how we think about the written word in sports media and on the internet?
It was great. I mean, the thing that they did that no one else did was they just brought in writers and then they said, "What are your ideas?" and go chase after that idea. And if it's weird and esoteric, we'll figure it out. And so a lot of the stuff I wrote was, there was some personal stuff in there. There was, so, I wrote like a 3,000 word piece about like a baseball board game that I used to play when I was a kid, like stuff like that. They would just indulge you and let you do that because that's what they wanted, was just interesting writing, and writing that, was as far outside the box as possible. So in that way, it was great. I mean, for me, it was before that I had been freelancing for ESPN's. They had a feature writing unit, I guess, that had various names, but it was, called E-Ticket for a while. It was called Outside the Lines for a while. And so we had this amazing editor there who would kind of indulge us in the same way. So there were those few years where, I don't think anybody had the internet figured out yet. So there was still this sense of like, hey, we can do whatever we want out here. Let's give it a shot. And, Bill Simmons had the clout and the money to be able to do it for a couple of years. ESPN before that had the, they were sort of wanted the street cred of having really good journalism. They still have, obviously a handful of really good journalists there, but they had sort of this whole, they had ESPN had Page Two, which was like,
yep.
This whole quirky. So I would write for that sometimes. Um, that's all. That's basically all gone now.
Yeah.
But there was this window of time where you could do it.
It's interesting. You mentioned Page Two, and that's I was thinking that as you were talking. It's like Page Two is kind of like the pre Grantland. It was, obviously Simmons came from Page Two and established Grantland as
Right.
its own before going over to before he moved on and now has the Ringer. And do you think so? I'm fascinated by this. What do you think happened? I mean, the story of how Grantland and why it got shut down was obviously much larger than just digital media, and it involved personalities and stuff like that. But do you think a Grantland type could survive today? Do you think there's still a place? I mean, a weird way to ask that, but do you think Grantland could survive, could still be doing it now? And why do you think maybe, from your experience writing and pitching and finding stories, you know, what changed about the internet that made it harder for sites like that to be supported and popular and kind of in the main the way they were maybe back in 2011 2014 range?
Yeah, it was interesting because Grantland started as, we're just going to do these big, long features. We're just going to do the big pieces. And then quickly they sort of realized that the internet, you needed a blog. You needed the fast twitch elements of this stuff too. Um, so, that was kind of an interesting evolution at that point. I think there's obviously like, you look at Substack now and you look at some of these quirky websites there's a few that kind of get through to people, but it's harder to make money. The corporate media just doesn't seem as interested in that stuff and doesn't really, I mean, they never really knew, like even with Grantland, ESPN was like, we're just going to throw Bill Simmons a bone because, otherwise he's going to leave and do it himself, which he did eventually anyway, you know. Um, but I think something like The Ringer still has the DNA of Grantland in it. I think they still sort of indulge, some quirky stuff and some personal stuff. They just have to move a lot faster now than they have to, you know, a lot of it's the way they make money now is through podcasts.
Right. Right.
So that's all kind of changed. Like the model of it has changed. And you being a journalism professor, you probably know more about how that stuff has evolved, but it's like it just evolves so quickly. It's just like it's constantly I don't know how to keep up with it anymore.
Same. I mean, I think you're right in the podcasting and podcasting. I feel like kind of took that space over, not obviously totally getting rid of long form, but the are we going to do indulge in a big piece or do you make it a podcast arc or a short episode,
Yeah.
and a podcast? And obviously, Simmons was, I mean, he was an early adopter. He was on the podcast thing before I think a lot of other media companies, to his credit. I think he saw that coming down the road and really did see that. But it is such a challenge to, I wrote about this today as we record this a few weeks ago as you guys are listening to this, but I think social drove so much for so long, but then social kind of is in a really kind of tenuous spot now with everything happening at X and Meta
Hmm.
and so I think that yeah, it's trying to keep up with it is hard, but also for a media company, not that I'm gonna give too much sympathy to media owners, but I don't think they know where to go. Like I think it really is kind of surprising, to be 20 years into this digital publishing and to kind of not know anything more than we did 20 years ago when we got our start.
Yeah, it's weird. I mean, we had all these moments of like, you remember the pivoting to video
Oh
moment,
yes, yep,
and that didn't really go anywhere.
no,
And then it was like, let's just embrace this social media. And then you have, all these sites like Axios that are just like, let's just, make things as bite-sized, as digestible as possible. And we always had that in a way. It's like you look back at USA Today, like when USA Today came out, people called it McPaper because it was like so generic, and there were no for the old people, there were like no jumps of the articles
right,
onto the next page. It was like
hmm,
everything's going to be these short little things. So I think there's always been a pushback against like long form stuff because it's just not as easy for people to digest, and it's a smaller audience and stuff like that. So I think it just takes out of the box thinking. It just takes people who are willing to take chances. And right now we're at this moment, you know, in a lot of ways where nobody's willing to take chances on anything.
yeah, that's a good point. And so, how does this, kind of steering it back to kind of writing and the writer's life for someone like yourself who freelances a lot? How do all these changes? What kind of impact do they have on your work, on the stories you're trying to pitch or write or report, or whether it's a book, a screenplay, or something like that, whatever media you're making? How do you kind of approach this world, this kind of uncertain media world, and carve out writing space and a career space?
I don't know. I have no idea, to be honest. It's just sort of you just go from moment to moment.
Hmm.
Um, I try to find things that can frankly pay the bills,
Hmm.
things that maybe I'm not super excited about, but that I can get done in a reasonable amount of time and that pay okay.
Hmm.
Those are harder and harder to find. And then be able to work on the bigger projects in the meantime. Um, but it's a struggle, man. Yeah, especially like since the pandemic, it felt like things changed
Okay.
even more, and it felt like a lot of those, things that you could count on were no longer there. So a lot of it's just, I'm looking at like my 1099s from this last year, and it's like, oh, I forgot I even did that, or I had
Yeah,
this
yeah.
project that I didn't even realize I had, but it was a few $1,000s, and it was, it was something to sustain me until, while I was working on the bigger projects,
Hmm. So,
essentially.
so I want to get to the bigger projects and obviously your newsletter first, but kind of just going back curiously, how did you get your start as a sports writer?
I was went to Penn State, worked at the school newspaper there, um, back in the ancient days. Did a couple internships at newspapers. Wound up in Akron, Ohio for my first job, and spent about 4 or 5 years there at the Akron Beacon Journal in Ohio, which was at that point a pretty good mid-sized newspaper. Um, then went to grad school and then moved to New York and then didn't really know what I was doing. I thought I would catch a job at a newspaper. I was kind of working part-time at Newsday. Um, your friend Adrian Wojnarowski tried to get me a job at his newspaper in New Jersey at one point. Um, and then I wound up writing a book, and then
Hmm.
kind of which was like short stories, and then kind of pitching a nonfiction book about like a high school chess team in New York City. So that was
Yep.
kind of my first nonfiction book. So that sort of moved me over into the freelancing, writing books, those sorts of things. But I always thought like, oh, I'll just work for a newspaper, work for a magazine, maybe, and then write books on the side.
Right.
But that lifestyle, I don't know. I don't even know if it exists anymore.
Right. No, that's I remember the Akron Beacon Journal is one of those like it's so one of the great tragedies of the newspaper. What's happened in the newspaper industry is those size market papers, which were either a good jumping off point or a career spot. There's great journalists working at size papers like that for their entire careers, and as they've been decimated, it's just when you're talking about your career path, it's just like I remember that, and it feels ancient to be able to talk about. Oh, I got an internship, then I got a job, and then I moved up to the newspaper, and that just feels like when when I taught undergrad or even graduate students, I'm like I can't even fathom giving that as career advice because it doesn't feel like that's even a thing anymore.
Yeah, I mean, it used to be that was like the incubator, It was like I worked there. Chuck Klosterman is one of my best friends, worked there. A guy named David Giffels was a columnist there, and he's written a bunch of books about Ohio, and Chris Broussard was, and now I think he's at Fox Sports or something. I can't remember. Brian Windhurst was like the young up and coming intern at the time, you know. So it was like this great staff, and there were a lot of very ambitious people there. It was just sort of a way to get your foot in the door. Now I don't know, like, sometimes I'll get journalism students who ask me what they should do, and I don't really have any idea at this point how you get that foot in the door and how you kind of get going.
So wanna pivot a little bit to your biweekly Substack Throwbacks, which is one of my favorites. It's worth a subscription if you haven't subscribed yet. I know we've linked to each other, so I appreciate that and all that. So I know you've been writing the Substack for a while, so I'm curious, how did this newsletter and whatever iteration it started, where did that idea come from? How did this start?
It started during the pandemic, actually, when
Okay.
I didn't really have much work going
Hmm.
on. And then I just sort of stumbled across, Substack is sort of like, oh, it's the new blogging platform at that point. And I was like, okay, I just need an outlet to start writing things. I'd always sort of looked at things through the lens of history and sports history. And so I thought, like, okay, maybe that's a good conceit for this newsletter. Um, And so that's just the way it started. And, it's not like a big money maker for me or anything like that. But it's a way to force myself to write and to think a couple times a week. And sometimes I'll get, somebody to read it or I'll get an assignment out of it or, um, it's just, kind of helps me to force myself to think and to write, you know,
Right.
at
So
least a
what
couple times a week.
what yeah, and why is that so important? I mean, I think I mentioned when I kind of revamped my own Substack, it was to write every week, and part of the inspiration was what you do at yours. So why is that for you important to force yourself to write and publish? Writing is one thing, but publishing it is another thing. So why is that so important to you as a writer?
It's a good question. I mean, maybe it goes back to working for a daily newspaper,
Yeah.
And I think, even like sort of the folks like somebody who I'm thinking of like Will Leach or something who like, kind of grew up in the blogging world. There's this once you start doing it and once you start being forced to write stuff and to actually put it out there, um, it's just a way to kind of keep your brain going and keep processing ideas and to realize that like sometimes you're going to write something that you like and sometimes you're going to write something that kind of sucks, but you've got to put it out there and you've got to just be processing ideas all the time. Because if you're not, then you're just going to get complacent and you're just not, your writing's going to just get stale and stagnant. So I think that's kind of the main, especially if, for younger writers, it's like just write somewhere, write something.
That discipline that have I've got to have something. It was very, I think we came out at some way from the newspaper background, like, oh, it's Wednesday, I got to have a column,
Yeah,
whether I got a great one or whether it's a notes column, I got to have something because I got to have something. So
yeah, yeah.
and so I love the you have at the in the footer of your newsletter, and I just love this newsletter is very much a work in progress. What's that mean to you?
Yeah, still don't really know. I mean, I sort of have a conceit for it, but I don't ever want to stick to that conceit all the time. I don't ever want to become formulaic. I think that's the main thing that I worry about with my writing is finding different ways to not get bored with it and to process it differently. I just did a podcast a few months ago that was about politics in San Francisco. Totally, totally off the beaten path. Kind of just stumbled into it with a couple guys who were down in LA and were interested in it too. Um, you know, screenwriting, I haven't made any money off of it, but it's just something, it's a different format that sort of challenges me. And I think the newsletter is the same thing where I'm constantly like, what do I want this to be today? From day to day, you're always like, what is this thing? I still don't have a good format. Like I want to do a notes column sometimes, but I'm like, there's not a format that I feel comfortable with doing a notes column at this point for this thing. If somebody was like, hey, you should do this, I would take a suggestion for it. Because sometimes I'm like, I don't really have one great idea, but so it's stuff like that. I think it's just. And I've thought more and more about like sometimes I don't want to write through the lens of history. Sometimes I just want to write whatever's happening right now. So I want it to have a little fluidity to it, I guess.
Yeah, and there's a certain level for me I found too, and I'm sure that if you feel this too, of when you write every week or you kind of have this kind of, you know, I think I called it my place to noodle. This is not my formal writing. This is kind of much more
Yes.
that work in progress type stuff. And it when I'm not on, I still feel the pressure, but when I'm on, I feel like, okay, it takes the pressure off. This is not a grand thing. This is just it's this week's thing, and next week there'll be another thing, and it kind of makes the process a little less precious and more like, okay, just write something, and then and the process, I found the process does tend to unstick me. When you write that, it becomes okay, kind of frees up space in my brain a little bit to kind of attack the bigger projects or to think differently about the one I'm writing on right now.
I think that's true. I think that's definitely true. I think it's just sometimes you just gotta force force yourself to keep moving, you
Hmm.
know.
Hmm.
It's the that's sometimes what writer's block is, right? It's that not forcing yourself to write garbage. You're not forcing yourself to write crap. And sometimes you just have to write crap. And sometimes I think my way of trying to avoid writing crap is to be like, okay, let me go back to 1975 and think about, this some idea, Sometimes I'm
Yeah,
just like I don't know what I'm writing for Friday, but I'm like, so I'm sometimes I'll just go on Wikipedia and be like, okay, what happened in, February 40 years ago or 30 years ago, and what's interesting to me about this thing, and then go on archival sites and go on newspapers.com and then figure out how can I build a post about this.
right. So where did the love and the writing using history as a lens, where did that idea come from? Like where did that start for you?
I think it started probably when I was well, I guess I always kind of loved writing the anniversary pieces and loved writing the historical pieces, even when I was at a newspaper. But I think when I was at ESPN, I got to write sort of a big feature about the death of Len Bias, the basketball player at the University of Maryland, um, and sort of a retrospective on that, and a couple other pieces in that vein. And then at Grantland, I would often write, well, where are they? Where are they now? Kind of pieces. Um, yeah, I always rebelled against reading when I was a kid,
Really?
Yeah, I mean, I liked reading like, Mad Magazine, Sports
Sure.
Illustrated, and, fantasy novels and stuff like that. But actual like historical reading, and then I remember thinking I was going to major or minor in history in college, and then I took a really boring history class because history can be really boring sometimes if you have a boring teacher. Um, and I think but I think I just sort of found it as I got older that there were there were all these things that just reflected what was going on in the current moment, and and sort of tracing with sports how people people want to put sports into a box by itself, but it's part of culture, it's part of society. So it's always going to dovetail with politics. It's always going to dovetail with pop culture. So it's kind of figuring out how to make those threads pull together. And I think with the Len Bias piece, there's so much about drug laws and the way it impacted that death, impacted so many people in the black community with these draconian drug laws for 30 years.
Yeah, and even, white me growing up in Buffalo, like the Len Bias was the ultimate cautionary tale. Like the story, which you and many others have written is false, but the story was he had never done cocaine until the night he was drafted, and he did it
Right.
once and died, and that will happen to you if you try it. Scared a generation of us straight, but obviously not true at all.
Yeah, exactly. And then you sort of get at that question of like, was it okay that they weave this into a myth so that some of us
Yeah,
didn't do drugs? But
right.
then there's obviously the dark side of it where, the penalties for these drug crimes imprisoned so many black people over the course of 30 years.
hmm Hey, I'm curious, since you've been doing the newsletter since you said right around or out of COVID now, and it's been a few years. How is the act of regularly writing this and researching this and all the work that goes into putting this together? How has that, if at all, affected the non-newsletter stuff, like your articles, your books, all the stuff that's not the newsletter? How's it impacted your writing there?
I think it's probably helped me hone in a little better on things,
Okay.
and be able to understand sort of my research process and maybe even my writing process a little bit. I'm working on, like, I'm ghostwriting a book now, that is at least partly historical. It's with kind of a prominent, I don't know if I'm allowed to say yet because I don't think the contract has officially been signed, but it's with a
Okay.
prominent sports broadcaster. I'll put it that way. But it's kind of about like certain events.
Okay.
Um, so it's been fun to kind of figure out how I can zero in on that research and sort of merge my voice with his voice. Um, and then I'm also trying to work on my own project, which is also historical, a book. Um, and I'm in the early stages of kind of working on a proposal for that. So just being able to understand, I think I don't write like a normal person. I don't know. I think I'm always trying to weave stuff together. The stuff I like is weaving various threads together. So it's like trying to figure out how to weave those threads together. Um, it's and make it coherent and make it make sense. That's what I like the most. Like I have like um there's a book that I'm sort of using as a model that came out a while ago, but it's called The Bronx is Burning,
Okay.
and it's about New York in the 1970s by
Yes.
Jonathan Mallor, who writes, I think he writes for the Times Magazine now. And just the way he was able to weave all these pieces of New York together, because it's about the New York Yankees and kind of that Reggie Jackson, Billy Martin era. But it's also about like the mayoral election. It's about like Rupert Murdoch buying the New York Post. And I just love that idea of sort of capturing a time and a place, and being able to weave all these threads together to show, how history is all kind of interrelated.
Well, one example that you did is an example, and I'll put this in the show notes, is the day we're recording this, you had a Substack, and it was kind of comparing Mark Zuckerberg with the Luka Doncic trade, and it was the idea that the Zuckerberg, the dot convert, the make stuff and break things, or move fast to break things, whatever it is, as like an ethos for the last 10 years, and how that plays in, that you connect that with Dallas trading away its star player for a guy who ends up getting hurt right away. And so I thought that was a brilliant little weaving of this thing and this thing, and you kind of show again that sports and cultural connection there, and how they interweave with each other. It was really really smart.
Thanks. Yeah, no, I think it was just trying to figure out, because I'm like a relatively casual NBA fan, and I knew this. I mean, this trade is obviously a big, huge, kind of shocking moment, but it just felt like the reaction to it was even bigger than what it was, and I was trying to figure out why that was.
Yeah.
And I think it did sort of strike a chord with what's going on in the current moment. I don't know if I got at it completely, but I think that's often why these things happen the way they do, is that there's something going on that resonates beyond sports, or that resonates at a bigger level.
Mhm. You mentioned your writing and research process. I'm just, curious. Are you, well, don't want to just ask what your process, but are you a bit by bit like research then write? Are you do all your research and then you sit down to write? Like what's kind of the research slash reporting? What's the marriage of those two processes together like for you?
Yeah, I mean, it's for the newsletter, it's a lot faster because I'm also like guilting myself where I'm like, okay, you're not making a lot of money off of this newsletter, so get it done in a few hours, if you can. So it's often like finding that one historical moment that can serve as a peg, and then kind of riffing from there, and then being able to maybe go back and do a little bit of research here and there as I'm writing through it. But it feels like once I find that main peg and I have a sense of what it's going to be, what it might be, maybe it won't be that, maybe it turns out to be something different. But just having that one moment helps me kind of get through the rest of it. With a bigger project, it's a lot more intimidating, and it's a lot more like, okay, I need to order 12 books off of, biblio.com, and, read them all and figure out like what the bigger themes are here and stuff like that. So, with those, it's a lot more reading. It's a lot more, digging deeper into the newspapers.com or whatever else and figuring out, what am I doing with this? How am I going to structure this thing? With the blog, with the newsletter, I guess what I like about it is that I'm just a lot of times I'm just riffing. I'm like, okay, where am I going with this? I don't know. Let's just see what happens here. And if it sucks, then maybe I won't run it.
Right. So I was thinking as I stare at my stack of best American sports writing for a research project I'm doing, I was feeling that same level of like, okay, sit down and read them, and you gotta very different than riffing for the blog, but kind of that
I would
that
imagine,
difference
is
level.
is this like an academic writing type of project, or
Yes. So that's obviously a lot more structured and a lot more kind of systematic in what I'm doing with it, with what you have to do with it. But it's also for a conference, so it's a little less. what's the word I'm looking for? Structured, I think. So it can be a little bit kind of combination of the two.
Okay, yeah. I just remember like being in grad school in it was like my late 20s
Hmm.
and writing a paper and kind of writing it like I would write an article.
Hmm.
And then the professor was just like, this is not how you write an academic paper, you know? And
Yes.
I was like, oh my God, I have no idea how you write an academic paper,
I
you know?
barely have an idea how to write an academic paper. I mean, is that's a whole other thing for another day. Just the that structure is hard to navigate, especially when you're coming, like we were from journalism, where it's very much narrative and there's a very more user friendly structure
Yeah.
than academics. So I know we're getting close on time here, but I want to give you a chance to answer the question I ask everybody on this podcast. What's the best thing you've read lately?
Best thing I've read lately. Oh boy. Um, like book wise, magazine wise, does it matter?
Doesn't matter.
Internet wise? Um, why am I blanking? Um, I'm actually, well, it's pretty good actually. I'm reading a biography of Bill Walsh that came out 20 years ago, um, by a guy named David Harris, who I think passed away. And I looked him up, and it turned out he was like a '60s activist.
Huh.
But I kind of love reading about Bill Walsh because he doesn't fit the archetype of a football coach in any way, you know?
Yeah.
And so that's been really fun to kind of go back and look at that. Um, I think there is, just in terms of journalism, I think there is more good journalism being written now than people are giving the mainstream media, as we call it, credit for, you know?
Right.
I think there's been some pretty good times in Washington Post pieces. I'm really into there's a guy named Philip Bump for the Washington
Yes.
Post who's been
Very
doing
good.
a lot of data journalism and stuff like that, and I'm really enjoying his stuff as well.
Yeah, and he's a good follow on Blue Sky too. So he's been very good to read. So, are there any? Do you have any aside from the newsletter? Any projects? I know you got the stuff you're working on that whether you can or can't talk about right now, but anything coming down the pipe that people might be interested in seeing or waiting for?
It's going to be a while, so I don't know if
Okay.
there's anything in particular at this point. I did do this podcast. It's called One Party Town. It's about San
Hmm.
Francisco politics and kind of the dysfunctional nature of it and also the influential nature of it. It lost a little steam just because of the way the presidential election went, but I'm
Hmm.
still pretty proud of how it turned out. So if anybody's interested in that, you can find that on all your podcast
All
networks.
right. Really quick, I meant to ask about that, and then conversation went another way. What was it? What's it like writing for podcasts versus writing for to be read?
It's definitely different because I tend to write, I don't know if you call it an elevated voice or something, but a little more of a writerly
Hmm.
voice, I guess. So I had to pull that back a little bit. But it was also really fun to kind of weave it together to figure out how to use sound bites, and just sort of, um, I don't know, it's all storytelling, I think. I think
Hmm.
that's the one thing is that it's there's different mechanics to it, but it's all
Hmm.
storytelling in the end.
Hmm. All right. Well, we'll throw a link to the that podcast in show notes so people can check it out, and links to the Substack so they can subscribe to you. And Michael, this is great. Glad we finally got to do this. Appreciate your time.
Yeah, thank you, Brian. Appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to The Other 51. Special thanks to Michael Weinreb for joining me this week. You can find all of his stuff and stories that we talked about in the show notes for our episode. If you like The Other 51, check out all of our past episodes wherever you get podcasts and leave us a rating. 5 stars would be very cool. Ellie Moritz does our music. Jen Moritz does our graphics. I'm Brian, and I'll talk to you again next time.